Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I'm Anthony Stalin, the co-director of the Janus Forum, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the 17th Janus Lecture entitled Building America, Who Should Control Urban Growth? As we're joined today by two experts on the topic, and I think we're really set to have a great and perhaps heated conversation, I'm going to keep my introduction very short and just tell you a little bit about our organization and our mission on campus. For those of you that don't know, the Janus Forum is a student group that seeks to encourage and elevate the level of thought, debate, and discussion around political and social ideas at Brown. And we do this through a broad range of events. We host Janus Conversations, which are smaller lectures with Brown professors. We hold lunch seminars at the faculty club, where students can come and enjoy a free meal while discussing a predefined topic. We also organize student debates, and then, of course, there are the Janus Lectures. As a senior and outgoing director, this will unfortunately be my last Janus Forum lecture. But in preparing for today's event and thinking back over the last few years, I'm convinced that the reason our organization is successful, the reason that we can put on about one event per week is not because of what we do as organizers, but because of what you do as participants. Our initiative at the Janus Forum is based on the firm belief that there's something special about Brown students, that our school is different from others because at Brown, we actively encourage independence of thought. Our organization only works, only exists, because you, as Brown students, are willing not only to stand up for your convictions, but to question them as well, by engaging each other respectfully and with open minds. At the Janus Forum, we don't avoid intellectual disagreements or opposing views. On the contrary, we seek them out. We believe that it is only by questioning our own beliefs and examining a broad range of perspectives that true learning can occur. Our president, Ruth Simmons, put it best when she said that at Brown, we encourage ideas and opinions to collide in the service of learning. And so the Janus Forum provides a place for people with diverse viewpoints to come together and discuss freely and passionately, a place where Brown students can come and learn about all the different perspectives and ideologies that are out there and then arrive at their own opinions, knowing not only what they believe, but why they believe it. Of course, none of this would be possible without the generous support of the Political Theory Project, which is an independent research center at Brown University dedicated to the study of institutions and ideas that make societies free, fair, and prosperous. But getting back to the topic at hand, we're gathered today to discuss fundamental issues concerning urban development in America. How should our cities grow? Who should control this development? The markets or the planners? And what are the costs and benefits associated with urban sprawl? To answer these questions, we're joined by two distinguished guests who will each speak for about 25 minutes. Mr. James Kunstler will speak first. Mr. Kunstler has long been recognized as a critic of urban sprawl and the high costs associated with an automobile-centric culture. He's the author of many books, including The Geography of Nowhere, The Rise and Decline of America's Man-Made Landscape, and he also writes regularly for the Atlantic Monthly, the New York Times Sunday Magazine, and other publications. Mr. Kunstler will be followed by Mr. Randal O'Toole. For almost 4 decades, Mr. O'Toole's research has held that too often government is the cause of, rather than the cure for, environmental problems. Mr. O'Toole is a senior fellow at the Cato Institute working on land use and transportation issues. He has authored many books, including The Vanishing Automobile and Other Urban Myths. After both speakers are finished, they will have the opportunity to ask each other one question, and following that, we'll open up the Q&A to the audience members who can ask their own questions. And I guess finally after that, after the Q&A is over, we invite you all to join us for a small catered reception in the front lobby. And now you've heard more than enough from me, so please join me in welcoming our first speaker, Mr. James Kunstler.
Thank you for inviting me here to Brown, you heroic young millennials, on this beautiful day in a beautiful city, Providence. How many of you would rather be in Houston today? Raise your hands. No? Okay. Well, to get to the heart of the matter, we have a problem, among other, we have a whole series of problems that are going to determine the outcome of how we build things in America and how we inhabit the terrain of North America. And the oil problem is a biggie. We import more than 2/3 of the oil that we use. The prospects that we're going to drill baby our way out of that predicament, the prospects for that is not good, or not good. And we're going to have to probably make other arrangements for many of the things that we do in the USA that are normal for us. By the way, anybody who doubts that the peak oil story is for real, this was just from 3 or 4 days ago. The U.S. Army, the U.S. military is now warning the public that we are facing a problem, a global energy predicament. So this is not a myth. And there are many new subplots and twists in the story that the public is unacquainted with, blissfully ignoring in order to play video poker and watch internet porn and do the other things that are normal for us in America. One of them is the oil export story. To put it as simply as possible, we are importers. We get exports from the other countries that send us oil. And many of those countries that produce oil, that send it to us, are actually in depletion. They're past their own production peak, and they have less and less every year. And they are using more of their own oil every year. Their populations are growing. They're buying more cars. They subsidize the cost of gasoline so that it's very cheap in places like Saudi Arabia and Venezuela, where they pay 35 cents a gallon for gasoline. So they are losing the ability to send us oil. The poster child for this problem is Mexico, our number 3 source of oil imports. Mexico depends on the Cantarell oil field, the second largest oil field ever found in the history of the oil industry. They depend on that oil field for more than 2/3 of the oil they produce. And the Cantarell oil field was one of the latest and last great oil discoveries of the oil age. And the diminishing returns of technology have come into play. You know, we often hear that technology will allow us to get out of this problem. New technology will allow us to get more oil out of even the existing played out oil fields. What actually happens is, you know, we find these oil fields late in the game. We use the latest technology, nitrogen injection into the rock, horizontal drilling, and it only has the effect of depleting the oil fields more efficiently. And that's exactly what happened to Cantarell. They are now depleting at the rate of about 15% a year, and their exports are going down even more steeply. So within about 48 months, they're not going to send us any oil. And we're not having any conversation about that in the public arena in America. And it's rather important because it's going to make a big difference to how we run our country. You can state that as a society becomes more and more stressed, the delusional thinking grows and grows. And one of the delusional memes that is making the rounds in America is that the earth has a creamy nougat center of oil, and that when the great fields deplete, that they'll just be replenished by this creamy nougat center. I have a special folder that I put ideas like this in called Complete Fucking Nonsense. Okay? So we don't even have to debate that. The whole peak oil story has had a strange implication and consequence for us. It's really pretty important. It implies that we're not going to be able to generate the kind of industrial growth that has been normal for not only just for our economy in general, but especially for the capital formation part of our economy, the part that is in charge of acquiring, accumulating wealth in a rational way and then deploying it for productive purposes once we've gotten it. And we do this in the form of banking and in the form of trading securities, like stocks and bonds that are based on the idea that we will have future wealth and that it will be of a certain regular, predictable sort of maybe 3 to 7% a year. And with the prospect of an energy crisis growing in the late 20th century, even the people on Wall Street began to notice that this would be a problem. They didn't maybe notice it directly, but they did notice that they were not getting the kind of profits from the stock markets that they had been used to. And in fact, the stock markets had not really produced wealth, when you figure in inflation, for about a decade. And so they undertook the engineering of a new set of Frankenstein securities that were designed not to get wealth from productive activities and the expectation that they would increase regularly and cyclically, but they undertook to engineer Frankenstein mutant securities that would produce wealth from nothing, that would get something for nothing, which is a major theme now in American life. So it's actually our major new religion, not evangelical Christianity, the worship of unearned riches. And the trouble with this is that these instruments that were created, the mortgage-backed securities, collateralized debt obligations, credit default swaps, etc., all turned out to be two things. And they're two words, actually, that we don't hear much in the discourse. But they're called swindles and frauds. And they ended up destroying the banking system. The banking system is now a zombie banking system, which is using accounting trickery to hide all of its losses, all of its non-performing assets, all of its bad loans, and all of the stuff that they've choked on and died. And the upshot of that is we do not have the kind of capital that we thought we had. And we are not the kind of wealthy society that we thought we were. The US is broke at all levels now, at the household level, at the corporate enterprise level, and at all levels of the government, municipal, state and county, and federal. We don't have any money anymore. The money has flown away into a black hole from which it will never emerge again. And this was the money that we hoped that we were going to build a post-fossil fuel economy with. And it will not be there for us to do it. And we have to make other arrangements now for how we are going to capitalize the ongoing project of civilization in the United States. And there are many implications to this. We're done with that. We're done with a suburban project. It's over. You can stick a fork in it. We're done. And one of the keys to understanding this is it doesn't matter whether you like it or not. It doesn't matter whether you want to choose it or not. And this was the theme, by the way, of a book that came out about 3 years ago from Bob Brueggemann of the University of Illinois, who wrote a book simply called Sprawl. It was basically a pro-sprawl book. And the thesis of his book was that sprawl is fine because Americans like it. Now, some of you who are in an advanced Ivy League school might identify that as tautological thinking. But that's the level of discourse in America now. And people believe that. But we're done doing this. We're finished with it because we're not going to have the energy to run that stuff and all of its accessories and furnishings, and we're not going to have the capital to build any more of it. The crux of the issue is suburbia, of course. And I have a way of describing it as the greatest misallocation of resources in the history of the world. And I refer to it that way for a reason. Because we're not going to be able to run it. We're not going to have the energy to run it as it has been designed to run. And therefore, it's going to lose value, both in terms of utility and money value. And therefore, it has poor prospects for the future. It's a living arrangement with no future. It has also provoked a very powerful psychology of previous investment. The psychology of previous investment. It means that you've taken all of your society's wealth and even invested your identity in a certain way of living, and having done that, you can't imagine letting go of it. You can't even imagine substantially changing it or reforming it. And that is probably one of the more dangerous things that we're facing, because it suggests that and I think we're doing exactly this, by the way. It suggests that what we're now going to do is mount a campaign to sustain the unsustainable at all costs, namely to keep our stuff going exactly the way we've been running it. And the wish to do that is perhaps understandable because of those profound investments that we've made. And by the way, another thing that we did, tragically, was that we turned this into our economy, the basis of our economy. We offloaded our industrial economy, the part of the economy that was devoted to making things of value. We sent it away, and then the real economy of the last 20 years was not the post-industrial economy. It was not the service economy. It was not the digital information economy. It was the suburban sprawl building economy. And what that means is we devoted our economy to building more stuff with no future. History is tragic, and history doesn't care whether we make tragic choices or not. We're going to have to live with the consequences of this, and that's why you are going to be a heroic generation. We do wish to keep it all running, but the key to understanding how this is going to work out, no combination of alternative fuels or systems for running them are going to allow us to run America the way we're used to doing it. We are not going to run Walt Disney World, Walmart, Suburbia, the US military on any combination of solar, wind, nuclear, biodiesel, ethanol, dark matter, used French fried potato oil, wishes. The list is very long, or even a fraction of it. We have to make other arrangements. We have to make other arrangements. And, unfortunately, we're having a very lame public discussion about this. I've been to the Aspen Environmental Forum for 2 years in a row. And that's where the elite of the cream of the environmental movement go, okay? And the only conversation they want to have is how they can continue running all the cars by other means. That's not good enough. That's not worthy of the best people in our society. We need to do better. We have to have a better conversation than that. And I don't want to be misunderstood. I am not against alternative fuels. I'm not against alternative systems of energy. But we need to understand this very, very key thing, that we're going to be disappointed by what these things can do for us. And we have to adopt a non-grandiose approach to what we're going to do. And probably the salient problem out of all of this is that we are not able to construct a coherent consensus about what is happening to us and what we're going to do about it. And it's terribly important that we do it. A lot of us who were following the peak oil story and writing about it the last decade thought that the car issue would be determined by the price of gasoline. But it turns out there are new subplots in the story that are entering the picture, and they're kind of interesting. One is, we are now in a crisis of capital, a crisis of available money. And one of the things that's going on is there are far fewer car loans that can be made now. There is less capital for people to borrow money to buy the cars, and that is the normal way that people are used to buying the hardware for motoring in America, on an installment loan. Fewer and fewer people will be able to do that, and that'll be another thing that'll make the system wobble and fail. Another thing is this: our governments at all levels are broke. They can't afford to do anything. Pay teachers, pay fire departments, do anything. And they have to fix the roads. And what we're going to see is incrementally less and less ability of the government to do that, to keep the roads repaired. We have to comprehensively respond to these things in an intelligent way. And you can state categorically what these things are. You can state with precision what these things are that we have to do. Basically, we have to make new arrangements for the complex systems we depend on for everyday life. We have to do agriculture differently because petro-agriculture is going to fail. We have to reorganize commerce. The big box model is going to fail, and we have to reconstruct local networks of economic interdependency, the very ones that were systematically destroyed by the big box people. We've got to do schooling differently because the centralized school systems are going to fail. We have to make some things in this country again, because we can't depend on getting plastic salad shooters forever from Asia. And we have to inhabit the landscape differently. And we're very fortunate that the new urbanists jumped into the dumpster of history 20 years ago. And the great achievement of the new urbanists, by the way, was not building the model communities, the traditional neighborhood developments, the new towns, Seaside, Kentlands, the things we know about. Some of them were wonderful projects. But the great achievement of the new urbanists was that they dove into the dumpster of history and they got back a whole set of principle and methodology and skill and knowledge that will allow us to reconstruct traditional human habitats, places that are worth caring about and places that are worth living in. And that is a tremendous accomplishment. If we don't fix the railroad system in this country, we're not going anywhere. We have a railroad system that would embarrass the Bulgarians. The infrastructure for fixing this is lying out there rusting in the rain. We shouldn't waste our time yammering about high-speed rail. We're too broke to build it. We got to fix the regular rail. People will be deliriously happy to get on a train that goes 70 miles an hour from Albany to Boston, okay? Let's start there and work our way up to the Bulgarian level of excellence. Demographic shifts are coming. They're not what people think. As the suburbs fail, they will not all move to the city. The cities themselves are not scaled. Our giant metroplexes are not scaled to the energy realities of the future. They're going to contract substantially, even while they densify and reorganize around their old cores. The action is going to return to the smaller cities and the smaller towns and the places that are scaled to the energy realities of the future. The action will also be in the places that have a meaningful relationship with local agriculture, because we're going to have to grow more of our food close to home. Maybe not all of it, but some of it. The action will not be here in Las Vegas. The excitement will be over for everyone but the tarantulas. If your Aunt Ginny wants to move to Phoenix, get down on your knees and beg her not to, because this is another place that has no future. It's going to dry up and blow away. We're done with that. Be very careful about making a distinction between solutions and intelligent responses. We hear a lot of yammering about solutions. For example, the solution to the problem of fossil fuels and transportation is electric cars, okay? Guess what? That's not really the solution. Because what it implies is we're going to continue to live in a car-dependent society. And that's insane, because we're not. Because we won't be able to. It's not because we're going to vote it out. It's not because central planners are going to force us not to. It's because the universe has reasons of its own for compelling us to change the way we live and change our behavior. So we need to think in terms of intelligent responses. And in my case, as an advocate of the new urbanists, I think the walkable community is where we should begin. The walkable neighborhood, the walkable town, the walkable city, and places that are worth caring about and places that are worth living in. So we can't afford this anymore either, okay? We got to man up. And we can't present ourselves as babies anymore, because we got too much to do. We got a big task list ahead of us. We don't have time to be crybabies, and that's why you guys are going to be heroic, because you're going to get us from this point that we're at now, this point of confusion and paralysis, and you are going to help us get to that future. So thank you very much. That's all I have to say for now.
Thank you, Mr. Kunstler. Please join me now in welcoming Mr. Randal O'Toole.
Okay, well, I'm also a Mac guy, and I'm stubborn enough that I have to use my own Mac because I only use Keynote software instead of that funny PowerPoint from the Microsoft empire. I always have to be different. Now, I like to think the smartest thing about smart growth is the name smart growth, because you can always accuse anybody who's skeptical of smart growth of being for dumb growth. In fact, that's the only thing that's smart about smart growth. So I figured in order to encapsulate the alternative to smart growth, we need another name that's also easy to understand, and that name is the American dream. So what do you think of when you think of the American dream? Some people think of getting in their car and going somewhere that's kind of exciting. Some people think of owning their own home. Some people think of starting a small business. Whatever you think of, it probably has a lot to do with mobility and property ownership, because that's really what the American dream has been all about. I think it's arguable that those are two of our most important freedoms. There are people who say they don't want the American dream anymore. They say we drive too much, we're too mobile. America is the most mobile society on earth. They want to curb that. Secretary of Transportation Ray LaHood says it's the Obama administration's goal to coerce people out of their cars. One way they want to do that is they want to lure people into public transit. But they also say that they don't like the way we live. They don't like the houses we live in because they waste too much land. The large yards we live on cause urban sprawl. And that's evil because it causes people to drive too much, and it causes people to convert farmlands and other lands, open spaces, to residential uses. So they want a higher percentage of people to live in high densities, whether apartments or condos or townhomes or whatever. Now, for me personally, these ideas might be a little bit attractive because I'm actually a rail nut. I helped restore this steam locomotive. It's the second most powerful operating steam locomotive in the world. I've run it. It's a great project. I'm also a bicycling nut. I bicycle thousands of miles a year. An ordinary day's bicycle is, for me, riding around Crater Lake 3 times, which is 100 miles with 12,000 feet of elevation gain. I also have spent 15 years of my career helping to save wilderness. This is the Mount Jefferson Wilderness. I live next to it, and I hike in there as often as I can. So I actually don't like auto driving. I don't like cars. The cars some of them are impolite to me when I'm on my bicycle. So I'm not really thrilled with cars. And yet when I look at the data, I have to say the automobile is the greatest invention in the last 200 years. And we would be foolish to do anything to give that invention up. And it's not just the automobile. It's not the automobile in general. It's an automobile in particular. In particular, the mass-produced automobile. When Henry Ford started producing Model T Fords on a moving assembly line, he doubled worker pay, he cut the price of his cars in half, and for the first time, the average worker could afford to buy the cars they were making. Up until then, mobility was something that was confined to the wealthy. We had trains, but only the wealthy could afford to ride passenger trains. We had electric streetcars, but only white-collar workers and their families could regularly afford to ride streetcars. Working-class workers, factory workers had to live within walking distance of work because a streetcar was too expensive for them. So when Henry Ford started producing his automobile, almost immediately, mobility increased. Not just mobility for the wealthy, but mobility for everyone. We can see from this chart that by 1925, the amount of mobility people had by the automobile exceeded all other forms of mobility combined. And today, the average American travels almost 20,000 miles a year, which is more than 10 times what the average American traveled 100 years ago. And 85% of that is because of the automobile. In that 100-year period, per capita incomes have increased 7 times. And I estimate that half of that increase is due to the automobile. The other half is due to other things like electricity, telecommunications, and so on. But the automobile played a very important role in that huge increase in inflation-adjusted incomes. The automobile also made possible things that we take for granted today, things like Walmart and BJ's supercenters and Costco's and grocery stores. In 1910, the average grocery store in America had 300 different products on its shelves. And the reason why is most people got to it by foot, and the average grocery store didn't have a big enough marketing area to offer more products. Now that automobiles can bring people in from miles around, the average supermarket has 30,000 products on its shelves. There are some stores that have more than 100,000 different food products on their shelves. That means that the average person, even low-income people, have access to all kinds of things that even the wealthy didn't have access to 100 years ago. The automobiles made possible all kinds of social and recreational opportunities, and perhaps most important, the automobile has brought home ownership to a whole new class of people. In 1920, only about 40% of American families owned their own homes. And again, it was white-collar workers, wealthy people, and so on. But working-class families, for the first time, when they could buy an automobile, they could drive to the edge of town, they could buy cheap land and build a house and own their own home. And so a lot of what we talk about of urban sprawl is really the ability of low-income and moderate-income people to own their own home. And that home ownership produces huge benefits. For one thing, studies show that children in families that own their own homes do significantly better in school than the children in families who rent. And that effect is most pronounced among low-income families. Studies show that most new small businesses in this country are started partly with finance provided by an equity loan that the business owner gets against their home. So if you reduce home ownership, you reduce the ability of people to form new businesses. And studies show that people in neighborhoods where most homes are owned have a higher quality of life. You can measure that they have a higher quality of life because people are going to take care of their homes when they own it. They're going to take better care of them than when they rent them. And yet, people say that we need to restrict the amount of single-family homes. We need to encourage more people to live in multifamily housing. And so they want to try to curb, they want to use the power of government to curb what they call sprawl. I don't see this. I don't see any point in this. At one time, they argued we had to do this because otherwise we're going to pave over all of our farmlands and all of our forest and all of our open space. Anybody who imagines this needs to get out of their car and off the interstate and see what America really is all about. This is a gigantic country. All of the urban areas in this country occupy less than 3% of the land area of this country. There's no chance that we're ever going to pave it all over. I mean, even New Jersey, 65% of New Jersey is rural open space. And Rhode Island is 75% rural open space. 73% Connecticut, and so on and so forth. Of course, coming from out west, we don't really regard New Jersey, Connecticut, and Rhode Island to be states because we have counties in almost every western state that are bigger than New Jersey. But it's useful to look at the data. Now, people also blame traffic congestion on urban sprawl. Well, that's so unfair because it turns out that, in fact, traffic congestion is a result of density, and urban sprawl is the response to traffic congestion. And in fact, if you look and see what's happened in our country, jobs have followed people to the suburbs, and now most workers, or a plurality of workers, live in the suburbs and work in the suburbs. A majority of workers work in the suburbs. Many of them live in cities and work in the suburbs. But because people adjust their commutes and densities moderate out to the point where there's less traffic congestion. Traffic congestion is to some degree a self-healing problem, especially if government gets out of the way and lets people live where they want to live. There's also been an argument that there's a cost of sprawl in terms of urban infrastructure, that it costs more to provide infrastructure to low-density development than to high-density development. This particular report a few years ago estimated that the cost of providing urban infrastructure to low-density development was about $11,000 more per home than to high-density development. Now, I want you to remember that $11,000 in a few minutes, but one of the problems with this report, it was based on greenfield development. It was based on greenfield low-density development versus greenfield high-density development. And yet that's not what the urban planners are talking about. The urban planners are saying we have a choice between greenfield low-density development or urban infill, where we make urban areas that already have people in them even denser. The problem with urban infill is you often then have to go in and tear up the streets, put in new sewer, put in new water, put in new transportation facilities to handle the people who are too numerous to be accommodated by the facilities you had before. That's a lot more costly than $11,000 per housing unit. Now, my former hometown of Portland, Oregon has become the poster child of smart growth. I want to tell you a few stories about what's happened in Portland. Portland's a great place to visit, mainly because, well, I'll get into that in a minute, but what they did in Portland is they drew an urban growth boundary around the city of Portland and 23 other cities. In Oregon, every city in the state is required to have an urban growth boundary. 97% of the land in the state is zoned rural or some more restrictive zone. In this area, you are not allowed to build a house on your own land unless you own 80 acres, you actually farm it, and you actually earn, depending on soil productivity, $40,000 to $80,000 a year farming it. And the urban planners are proud of the fact that they have only had to give 100 permits per year in rural areas to build new homes, and everybody else has had to live in one of the urban areas. In order to avoid expanding the urban growth boundaries, they have decided to densify the city. They have decided to go into urban neighborhoods of single-family homes and rezone them for apartments. So your single-family home might have, your next-door neighbor might build an apartment in their backyard. And the zoning in some places is so strict that if your house burns down, you're not allowed to rebuild it. You're required to build a row house or an apartment or some other multifamily dwelling that meets the minimum density of the zone. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about government controlling how our cities grow rather than letting the market work. Well, the effect of this is that it makes housing more expensive. Most Americans, more than 80% of Americans in survey after survey say they aspire to live in a single-family home with a yard. And a house like this, 4-bedroom, 2.5 bath, 2,300 square foot house with a family room and 2-car garage on a quarter-acre lot in Houston, Texas, recently sold for $150,000. You add smart growth, in Portland, that same house would cost you $320,000. In Boulder, Colorado, $600,000. San Jose, $1.2 million, all because of artificial housing restrictions imposed by smart growth planners. We've made housing unaffordable, and I have a paper you can download from the web. It shows how urban planning caused the housing bubble that we just went through that just caused the current economic crisis. Now, urban planners in Portland and elsewhere have a solution for congestion. It's called more congestion. Their goal is to make the city as congested as possible, hoping that it'll get a few people out of their cars. They say congestion signals positive urban development. When asked, why do you want to make it more congested? They say, well, if we did anything to relieve congestion, people would stop riding the expensive light rail trains we've built all over the place. So what are they doing? They're putting what they call traffic calming, which means congestion building features in streets, like little rotaries in the middle of intersections. They're narrowing streets. This is supposed to be a major bike route, but it's too dangerous for me to ride on anymore because there's no room for me and a car because they've narrowed the street. And then they take money that comes out of gas taxes, money that's a user fee paid by automobile drivers, and they divert that money to build light rail, such as this light rail line in Portland. Oh, excuse me, that's actually a light rail line in Moscow. Whenever I see a light rail train in front of an ugly apartment building, I think it's in Portland, but I should have known the difference because you can tell this one in Moscow it's sunny, and in Portland it's rainy. Now, I don't want to say nobody rides Portland's light rail line. It actually carries almost 1% of all passenger travel in the Portland area. But one day, a train left the station and one passenger was on board. Now, coyotes like to go where they know they can find solitude from people. Portland recently started a commuter train. They spent $160 million starting the train. The train loses $30 million a year in operating costs. It carries 250 round-trip riders a day. The amount of money they spent on the train was enough that they could have given every single one of those riders a new Toyota Prius this year, next year, every year for the next 30 years and saved money over that commuter train. That's the problem with alternatives to the automobile. You know, it's real great to think about riding the bus or riding the train or so on, but they're really, really expensive, and we make up for that expense with gigantic subsidies that somebody has to pay. Last year, the average American spent about 22 cents a passenger mile driving in cities in their cars. And there were subsidies to driving, but they added up to about a penny a passenger mile. So 24 cents a passenger mile is what it costs, including all subsidies and personal costs of driving. By comparison, transit on average costs 90 cents a passenger mile, 70 cents of which is subsidized. Notice the user fee is about the same in all cases, but the subsidies just grow and grow and grow. And some of the commuter rail lines are subsidized far more than you see here. So when we're talking about getting people out of their car, we're talking about getting people out of a cheap, convenient, fast form of transportation and putting them in an expensive, inconvenient, slow form of transportation. I don't see what the point is. Turns out transit uses energy just like cars. Some of it is oil, just like cars. Some of it is other fossil fuels. And the transits, you don't get any net energy savings getting people out of their cars and on a transit. The same is true with high-speed rail. Most of the high-speed rail lines proposed by President Obama are going to be diesel-powered trains running at up to 110 miles an hour. That's not very fast. For intercity travel, Americans spend less than 15 cents a passenger mile driving their car. With the subsidy, it's about 16 cents. Buses are about the same. Airline travel is actually a little bit cheaper. Amtrak is 60 cents a passenger mile. Somebody's going to have to subsidize it. High-speed rail is going to be 75 cents a passenger mile at least, 5 times flying. And then there's the bus. Nobody talks about the bus. The bus, intercity buses are the most energy-efficient form of land transportation we have. Urban buses are one of the least energy-efficient forms of land-based transportation. What's the difference? Well, intercity buses go where people want to go because the companies want to make a profit. Urban buses go where the taxpayers are because the public transit agencies want to serve the people who are subsidizing them, not the people actually be marketed. So their buses run around empty. The average transit bus is 1/6 full. So the next time you drive a car, 5-passenger car, and you're the only occupant and you're feeling guilty because you're in a single occupancy vehicle, remember, your car has a higher occupancy rate than the average public transit vehicle in the United States, bus or rail. Oh, by the way, back to the bus versus high-speed rail, Megabus charges starting fares between Washington and New York of $1. They go up to $15. Amtrak's high-speed train starts at $130 and goes up to $200. And you save about 85 minutes. I think it's a no-brainer. If you're paying for yourself, you're going to take the bus. If somebody else is going to subsidize you, well, then you'll take the train. But if you're going to pay for yourself, you're going to take the bus. What happens when there's nobody left to subsidize us because we're all taking the train? It's not going to work. As far as energy efficiency, 40 years ago, cars were a lot less energy efficient than transit or trains. But today, cars have become far more energy efficient, whereas transit has become less energy efficient because we've run transit lines into neighborhoods where people have 3 cars in every garage and they don't ride transit much, so we have all these empty transit vehicles. By 2025, the average car on the road is going to use less energy than the most efficient transit, the most efficient high-speed rail lines in America. There's no point in trying to get people out of an efficient form of travel into an inefficient one. Right now, you can see buses for intercity are by far the most energy efficient forms of travel. Automobiles today are about the same as Amtrak. By 2025, automobiles will be far better than Amtrak. And another thing, people say, well, if we get people into multifamily housing, we'll save energy on housing too. But it turns out, according to the U.S. Department of Energy, single-family detached homes use the least amount of energy per square foot of any form of housing. So if you get people into multifamily housing, they'll only save energy if you also force them to live in smaller homes. Now, some people say that rail transit promotes economic development, and this is an argument in favor of promoting rail transit and then getting transit-oriented development. Portland built a rail line in 1986, and they zoned everything for high-density, mixed-use development, transit-oriented development. 10 years later, this is what they got, nothing. So starting in 1996, they decided to subsidize it. Since then, they've given close to $2 billion in subsidies. They've given property tax waivers to people building in these zones. They've used what's called tax increment financing, which is basically stealing money from the schools and the fire and police and giving it to developers. $2 billion in subsidies to subsidize high-density developments like this one. Well, actually, this one was in the former East Germany. It was built during the Soviet era. Here's the one in Portland that received $13 million in subsidies. The difference is that when the East Germans got their freedom, when Germany reunified, they all moved out. And when I took this picture, this building was scheduled to be torn down because they all moved into single-family homes. Whereas now that Portlanders have lost their freedom to be able to buy affordable single-family homes, people are having to live in places like this. Now, according to the planners, and I think the planners are optimistic. According to the planners, Portland's plan is going to have this effect on our driving. As of 1990, 92% of all travel in the Portland area was by car. About 2.5% was by transit, about 5% was walking and bicycling. They want to build 150 miles of light rail lines. They want to build dozens of Stalin-esque high-density developments, and they predict that when this is done, that transit share will increase from 2.5% to 5%. And bicycling will increase from 5% to 6%, which means driving will drop all the way from 92 to 88% of travel. But they're expecting 60% more people by 2040. And so we're really going to have a huge increase in driving, which means a huge increase in congestion, which means a huge increase in energy wasted and pollution, because that's what happens in congestion. Actually, that was their prediction, but it isn't working out very well. Since 2000, the percentage of people riding transit has significantly dropped. Percentage of people riding transit to work, according to the Census Bureau, the actual number of people riding transit to work. In the year 2000, we had 2 light rail lines. In 2007, we had 4 light rail lines and a streetcar line, and the number of people riding transit to work declined by 1,000. Whereas the number of people driving to work increased by more than the total number of people riding transit to work. So light rail is not getting people out of their cars in Portland, and there's no reason to think that it would. Here's a chart showing population density of urban areas versus the percentage of people driving to work. You can see there's a very shallow trend. At the far left of the chart, your far right, there's a very slight dip in the number of people driving to work at the high densities. But there are other communities that have smaller numbers of people driving to work, it has nothing to do with density. Density is not the way to get people out of their car. So smart growth makes housing unaffordable. It means more traffic congestion, which means more energy wasted and more pollution. It means higher taxes and lower urban services, and it has minimal effects on driving. We had this debate 40 years ago when we talked about clean air. We said we should try to get people out of their cars and so they'll pollute less. We did that, but we also made cars less polluting. Today we drive almost 3 times as much as we did 40 years ago, and our total pollution is 1/3 as much. We failed at getting people out of their cars, but we reduced pollution. Now personally, I don't care where you live. You want to live in a high-density development? Fine. You want to live in a suburban home? Fine. You want to live in an ex-urban rural place? Fine. You want to get around on a bus? Fine. You want to take a cable car? Fine. Bicycle, walk, drive, whatever. What I care about is that we make decisions that make sense, economic sense, and the best way to do that is to fund transportation out of user fees rather than out of government taxation. Now, there's some simple things we can do to relieve traffic congestion. We can use traffic signal coordination. That's a very low-cost way of relieving traffic congestion, and it actually results in a negative cost for reducing CO2 emissions. Notice that if you want to use compact development or light rail to reduce CO2 emissions, the cost is thousands of dollars per ton. We can build high occupancy toll lanes. It'll give people a choice. You can drive on the freeway that's free but isn't congested, or you can drive on the high occupancy lanes that charge you something, but you have absolutely no congestion. These high occupancy lanes are very successful in Southern California. Here you can see a video. The high occupancy lanes are moving, the other lanes aren't. Even though they don't look very crowded, the high occupancy lanes are actually moving far more people than the low occupancy lanes. Where we have to, we can build new facilities. We have new techniques of building elevated roads that are almost as cheap as building at ground level roads. We can use what are called public-private partnerships. This is a public-private partnership built road in Europe. What they did is the French government said, here's a place where somebody can build a road, you build it, you pay your money, you toll it, user pays, and after 40 years the road becomes public. Here's a bridge that was built in France. It's the highest bridge in the world. It's 1.5 miles long. It's taller than the Eiffel Tower. It cost billions and billions of euros to build. It was built entirely with private money. Cost 6 euros to cross it, and it was a great success. I think for transit is necessary, at least in the short run. In the long run, I've got some ideas. I don't think we're going to need transit, but in the short run, transit's necessary. But the way to make transit work is to have a competitive system instead of government-run monopolies. I'm out of time, but I hope you'll bear with me and let me give you a brief story about a housing community that I think is well done. Jim asked you if you wanted to be in Houston. I don't want to be in Houston because there's no mountains there, but this community is in Houston. The developer, in Texas, counties aren't allowed to zone. The developer went out and bought 10,000 acres of land. The developer put in all the infrastructure, the streets, the water, the sewer. They put in a water park. They set aside land for parks. They set aside land for commercial areas. They set aside playgrounds. The homeowners associations got together and funded ballparks and other facilities. The housing is cheap. You can buy a 3-bedroom, 2-bath home for $150,000. Housing starts really, really inexpensive. And everything is paid for. The users pay for it. There are no subsidies. Once you leave the development, you want to drive to Houston, there's a toll road that was built very cheaply. They built a 7-mile-long 4-lane highway for less than the cost of building 1 mile of light rail. It's all paid for out of tolls. The users pay. That's the kind of system that I support, a user pay system, a market system. Now, I know you didn't come here to buy books. I do have 2 recent books, and I do have a couple copies of each if anybody really wants one. I also have a bunch of papers that you can download online, and I have a blog called The Anti-Planner. Just Google Anti-Planner, and I'm the first thing on the list. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. O'Toole. We'll now move into the Q&A part of this event, starting off with the speakers asking each other a question. As there are many audience members who wish to ask questions and we only have a very limited amount of time, we ask that you be concise as possible when asking your question. And similarly, we ask that both speakers keep their answers short as well. One final note, each lecture we hand out the Hardball Award to the person who asks the most challenging, interesting, and thoughtful question. So if you wish to be considered for the award, please state your full name before asking your question. However, beware if you ask a particularly easy or non-rigorous question, in which case the shameful softball award awaits you. And with that, let's begin with Mr. Kunstler's question to Mr. O'Toole.
Okay, I want to ask you a multiple choice question because you inveigh so much against the public funding of public transportation and rail in particular. I want you to tell me, I'm going to give you a multiple choice for who pays for our highways. A, the Procter & Gamble. B, Santa Claus. C, the Easter Bunny. D, government.
80% of the cost of our highways is paid by users out of user fees like gas taxes, taxes on motor vehicles and on tires. And there are some subsidies to highways. I oppose those subsidies. I think we should get rid of them. But they're almost all at the municipal level. There's very little subsidies at the state level, and there's no subsidies at the federal level. The interstate highway system, for example, was built entirely out of user fees. It was built on a pay-as-you-go system. They did not borrow any money to build it. I think it was a successful system. It was one of the few successful public works projects we've seen.
And
well, Jim, if you don't mind if I call you that.
No.
You spend a lot of time talking about the horrors that we're going to face because of peak oil. And I'm not entirely convinced, but let's say you're right. Let's say we are running out of oil and gasoline is going to get to be real, real expensive. But I'm still concerned why you think that means we need to have the government to get involved. Because if gasoline gets expensive, people are going to respond. They'll drive less, they'll drive more fuel-efficient cars, they'll drive to different places that are less congested, and so they will waste less fuel. Why do we have to have the government try to change the way people live?
Well, you're actually drawing a false inference about my thinking. And, you know, I want to introduce an idea. I had a father-in-law who was a scientist for IBM, later for the National Science Foundation, and was a Harvard overseer. And his favorite book was called How to Lie with Statistics. There isn't an occupation in America in greater disrepute than econometricians, except for two: politicians and bankers. I think that you are using your statistics in a way that is less than completely honest. And moreover, I think that they're geared entirely toward a set of circumstances that are moving into the past, so that the equations and formulas that you're basing your econometrics on are really not with us anymore and increasingly are going to be false.
okay, great. Now let's move to the audience questions. If you have a question, please line up at one of the mics now. Will, you go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question for Mr. Mr. O'Toole. I was wondering, the price system seems to be a great way of communicating information about the scarcity of a certain good. I'm sorry, for Mr. Kunstler. And I was wondering...
Your hand.
It's for you, sir.
Okay.
And I was wondering why, if there's this critical shortage of gasoline, prices are so low. Why, despite the fact that business is apparently run by these barons who are very shrewd and taking, they're fleecing people for money, how they haven't figured out that why, if gasoline is so scarce, I can drive all the way across the country for what it costs to, say, have 2 big dinners at a nice restaurant. Now, why isn't the price system accurately reflecting what you refer to?
It's very simple. gasoline is not yet scarce in the way that it is going to be scarce. You know, we're talking about the prospects for the decade or half-decade ahead, not what is actually happening right now. Right now, demand and supply are probably just about equally balanced, and the system happens to be in equilibrium. We are leaving that behind. And as we leave that behind, you're going to see the price of gasoline and oil in general become very volatile. I'll remind you that right now, oil has passed the $80 mark, marching towards 85, and as that occurs, we're going to get into the danger zone where the price of oil begins to really seriously harm our economy. So the fact that you don't see high gasoline prices at this moment doesn't mean that we're not heading into the direction of them in the very near future, sooner rather than later.
But, sir, first of all, from $80 to $85, have you factored inflation into that? And secondly, if this is a type of foresight that's quite obvious to you, why isn't it also obvious to the people that have millions of dollars invested in this? Because most goods that the market sells also have an idea of future usage built into them, like property. That's why property is so expensive.
The price of oil since 2000 did not go from $80 to 85. It went from $11 a barrel to $147 a barrel, back down to $38 a barrel, and back up to $85 a barrel. What you're going to see, as well as high prices, is a lot of disorder and volatility in the markets, because the oil markets are complex systems. They're just as much complex systems that we depend on as our food production system, as our capital finance system, as our transportation systems, as our commerce systems. And these are systems that are going to fall into disorder, and their disorders and failures will mutually reinforce each other.
Thank you.
Thank you. Kyle.
My question is for Mr. O'Toole. So one of the important roles of government is ensuring that we have an equitable society. We've talked about the Political Theory Project's mission includes equity as a major component and fairness specifically. And when you're thinking about different transportation options, it's true that many Americans own cars, but there are also many Americans who can't afford cars, and they are often the ones who have the least amount of choice in terms of transportation decisions. And so by making an argument for a market-driven society, you are really leaving a lot of people at the bottom end of the economic barrel sort of out to dry. So I was wondering how you would respond to that, and maybe how to include low-income individuals in your vision of the future.
Well, first of all, 92% of American families have a car. The percentage of the remaining 8%, a significant percentage of those are people who could afford a car but decide not to have one. The main people who can't afford a car and don't have one are people who what has been referred to as the permanent underclass. They're victims of historic racism and serious other problems, and just giving them a free transit pass is not going to help them. In fact, a study done in Portland found that giving somebody who lacks a high school degree a car is going to enable them to find a job and will enable them to earn more money and will enable them to do better than if they got a high school degree. So a car is more valuable to you than having a high school degree, and so there are programs called welfare to work programs that help low-income people get their first car. And if you're worried about helping somebody that's low income, the solution is not to totally transform society so that the rest of us don't drive, but encourage them, give them the opportunity to have the car, which will enable them to reach their economic potential, find more jobs, get better education, and so on.
Thank you. Lily?
Yeah, I wanted to go back to Mr. Kunstler in regards to the question of oil, and also to combine it with Mr. O'Toole's question from the debate. You're right in the sense that oil has been volatile and even more complex than other market systems such as food, because there are so many political implications with oil, especially in the Middle East. But given all of that, we've seen personal, individualized reactions when the price of oil has changed. When oil has risen to $147 per barrel, people cut back on their oil usage, started using smarter cars. in Europe, with artificially high oil prices from government taxes, et cetera, people use smart cars almost exclusively. So again, my question goes back to, why do you think it's government that should make these decisions and not individuals?
My arguments have nothing to do with whether government is going to direct our behavior. Reality has mandates of its own. We're going to be responding to the mandates of reality, not the mandates of the government. And the whole argument that this is about government control of people is a false argument.
Okay.
Thank you. Question?
For the first speaker, I mean, I love my car and driving in it. I also love living in a single-family home, and millions of people love doing that. And you can argue about peak oil, whether it's in 10 years or 20 years or 30 years, but how could you possibly make a rational argument against electric vehicles with economies of scale and renewable energy powering those electric vehicles with economies of scale?
Are you asking me?
Yeah.
I can possibly do it because they don't comport with reality, because we're not going to be able to do it, because we're going to be disappointed by what those alternative fuels can do in the way of producing enough electricity to keep on running it, and we're also going to be saddled with tremendous obstacles in capital and in having enough money to do the kinds of things that you're suggesting. Now, I'm completely sympathetic with the idea that people do what they like to do and that people do what makes them comfortable and happy. I'm even willing to admit that big suburban houses are probably very comfortable for people. But this is not really so much a matter of what we choose and what we want. It's a matter of what reality will allow us to do. It's a matter of what the circumstances of our time are going to permit us to do. So it's another false argument to say that just because you like something means that you're entitled to live that way. Now, I don't want to necessarily deprive you of comfort and convenience, but I would like to urge you to make your choices about the future in relation to what's really happening, not in relation to what you wish. And one of the main things that we're going to have to make a distinction about in this country is the difference between wishing for stuff and making stuff happen. Because right now we're very confused about that in America.
Just real quick, the only real argument I heard against the possibility of a lot of renewable energy in electric cars is not enough capital. And like there's a huge amount of capital in the system, and with the right investments, any of these things could happen. So I don't
Well,
see
you're
how
just
that's
making
not
an
sustainable.
assertion yourself. There's a huge amount of capital.
I mean,
The
there's
capital is
a $78
vanishing.
trillion a year economy in the world.
Well, it's becoming a much more austere economy.
Thank you. Let's go to this side. If you want to be considered for the award, please state your full name.
Hi, I'm Aaron Morissette, otherwise known as Badger. My question's for Jim. I mean,
You
look
sure
at
it's not Hector?
Yeah, for you, Jim. Here in Providence, I don't know if you got a chance to see the terrain here much in this lovely city. There's a big move for urban organic farming. It's also a big move towards making it a more bike-friendly city, which it's about the worst city in the world to ride a bike in right now. But people are working really hard to change that, which I think is great. And as far as, you know, your statement about wishing for something and then actually living up to the reality of what's really happening, do you have any suggestions for us here as to what we can do to make Providence a bit more of a sustainable city in the future?
Well, I think as American cities go, actually Providence is doing very well compared to many others. The revival of your downtown has been remarkable. You have wonderful, beautiful neighborhoods that people care deeply about and take a lot of trouble to maintain in good condition. You know, I think that this is one of the cities that is also, it happens to be fortunately scaled to the energy realities of the future. It's extremely fortunate that it has a good harbor, because one of the things we're going to see in the future is that water transport and maritime trade will become much more important again in the future than it has been for the last 60 years, and that's going to make a big difference for Providence. So I think that you're very fortunately placed to meet the exigencies of the future compared to a lot of other places. You know, when Tucson is depopulated, Providence will still be here thriving.
Great, and I do read the Daily Grunt. Well, it's more like the Weekly Grunt, but on Mondays. And what's your problem with tattoos? You lay into tattooed people a lot, so I just...
I do. Well, frankly, I think that it represents a kind of barbaric self-mutilation that we could do without.
Okay.
But getting your ears pierced is okay.
Yes. Well, that's an ornament. It's not a mutilation.
Okay, thank you. Question over here.
My name is Leo Pollock. I'm curious, this is a question for Mr. O'Toole. I feel like a lot of times the conversation, I agree with you to some extent that a lot of times when government makes decisions, they're not very efficient, they're not necessarily in the best interest of people. I would also argue, I think you're overlooking the fact that unfortunately the market tends to be driven by profit most of the time, not necessarily in best options for health of communities, transportation, serving low-income communities. So what I'm curious is, I studied in the Netherlands for a couple of years, and they've sort of pioneered a model where government essentially is in a conversation with community members and businesses, sets the framework for planning, and then allows businesses to find the most efficient ways to meet those within certain guidelines. And I'm curious what you think of that in the context of it seems troubling to just let the market run free. We've seen what's happened with healthcare. We've seen what's happened with the financial industry when the market essentially controls its own destiny.
Well, a couple of centuries ago, the Netherlands was the richest country in the world, and now it's approximately on a par with Iceland, if that good. Now, wealth is not the only thing to consider. There's livability and lifestyle and stuff like that, but it helps. And when people talk to me about Europe, I have to wonder how much of Europe have they seen? When you go to a place like Europe, you often go as a visitor and you see it through the eyes of a tourist, and which means you go ride the transit systems, maybe you ride a bike, maybe you ride the high-speed train, but guess what? That's not the way Europeans live. Europe has become more and more like the United States. It is decentralizing rapidly. The population density of major urban areas is rapidly declining. Inner Paris has lost 3/4 of its population in recent decades. Most of those people have bought in single-family homes out in the suburbs. The main people living in high-rises are immigrant laborers, not the natives of Europe. In 1980, they had one high-speed rail line in Europe, and rail carried more than 8% of passenger travel. Today, they've got high-speed rail all over Europe, and rail carries 6% of passenger travel. America, we are addicted to our automobiles, and we drive for 85% of our travel. Those green Europeans drive for 79% of their travel. Really, the differences between Europe and America aren't that great, except for Europe has so much regulation, so much smart growth, so much land use regulation, and so high taxes on driving, the cheap form of travel, that European incomes are a lot lower than ours. And I think I would rather live in a country that has more freedom, more opportunities to choose whether I want to go out and earn a profit and get wealthy, or I want to go out and do as I've done in my career, which is mainly work in the nonprofit sector. But I wouldn't have had that opportunity in Europe. That there isn't as big a nonprofit sector there because they can't afford one.
But do you think that the market, given its control over itself, really has what ultimately do you believe is in the interest of the market? Do you think that it's profit?
I don't have any problem with the profit motive, because the only way I can earn a profit in the market is if I make something that you want to buy. In 1910, there were 100 automobile companies in this country that were making cars for the rich. They're all out of business now. The companies that are left are the ones that made cars for the average people, because they made a lot more profits by making cars affordable, by making cars cheap, so that working class people could afford to buy their cars. So the market works by making things that everybody can use. And, oh, sure, I'm not going to be driving a Bentley anytime soon, but the car that I do drive, or the bicycle that I ride, will go on the same roads as the Bentley. and I have no problem with that.
Thank you. Dan?
Hi, my name is Dan McCombie. My question is actually, it's an iteration on one question for either of you. So to Mr. Kunstler, my big question is, I think most of your arguments very much resonate with me, but the one that I haven't answered for myself, or I feel like you might not have fully answered, is a piece of the quality of life argument, which is essentially...
Say that again?
A piece of the quality of life argument, which is essentially space. Many cities have been known for very poor planning around creating open public green spaces, and I think that was one of the things that Mr. O'Toole was harping on. So my question for you is, do you have in mind any good examples of how that's done, and how do you think city planners can better encourage that given the economic and geopolitical climate that's faced by cities?
American cities have had elements of them that are very unsatisfying for a long time. And one of the reasons for this is that we try to design our cities on the basis of things like econometrics and statistical analysis. What we leave out completely is artistry, which has nothing to do with adding up numbers. You know, we're making a big mistake in this country. We think that just because we can measure things, that we can control things. It's kind of a weird collective control freak thing that we got going on. If we want to have places that are worth living in, places that are worthy of our affection, we're going to have to pay attention to the artistry and the care and the thought that goes into this, to the quality of assembling and designing places that we live in, not just the numbers and statistics and dollars and market issues. And, you know, that has left us in a pretty poor place.
Thank you. And for Mr. O'Toole, my question is, you know, I'm very appreciative that you have such great respect for the outdoors and like to spend so much time there, but so many of the communities in the exurbs and the suburbs in most major cities have very little access to major, more wild, shall we say, forested, non-grassy field green spaces. Why do you feel that is? And, you know, if that is something that has been seen as so important, the access to space and the ability to move around space, what do you think is missing from that?
Well, a lot of older communities were built at a time when people's priorities were different than they are today. People didn't care as much. They didn't want that open space. They wanted a job. They wanted income. They wanted food for their families. Those were their priorities. Now, income is a very small, or excuse me, food is a very small proportion of our personal expenditures. Transportation is a small proportion of our personal expenditures. We have a lot more discretionary money that we're interested in using on things like recreation and the outdoors. And so our tastes have changed, and the market reflects that. That community that I showed you outside of Houston is a beautiful community. We may not like the Houston climate, but a planner can't change the climate. But that community was very well planned. It was planned entirely by the private sector. There was no government planning at all. It paid for itself. It's a beautiful community. It would be a great place to live. If I have to live in Houston ever in my life, I would like to live in a place like that. That's what you get if you let the developers alone, if you let them do what the market wants to do. They will provide lots of open space. About a third of that community, of the land in that community, is open space. Golf courses, ball fields, there's a wild forest area. All kinds of walking paths, all kinds of other open spaces there. So I think the obstacle to open space, as much as anything, is the government planners saying, we have to develop all the open space so that we don't have to lap out of our urban growth boundary. In the city of Portland, they've rezoned golf courses and sold for housing, and they've sold city parks to developers who will put in high-density housing to meet their population density targets. That's not the kind of planning you want to see, and that's what you get when the government starts planning.
But I think there's a little bit of a fallacy in that argument because, I mean, I've been to Houston, and maybe I'm wrong, but most of the communities like that are built on former farmland or open space area. So when you talk about them leaving 25% of the area, what was underneath the other 75% previously?
Well, you know, it was built on farmland, but 95% of Texas is open space. And it's not exactly the primest farmland in the world anyway, and so I don't really see what we're losing converting. We're not destroying that open space. We're converting it from one form to another. People's backyards are open space. And so if you build low-density housing, you're providing open space that isn't used. I mean, what is farm? You can look at a farm, but it's a monoculture. It's not good for wildlife. It's not good for watershed. They put huge amounts of poisons on it, fertilizers, and so on and so forth. Whereas a suburban neighborhood turns out to be optimal for many forms of wildlife, songbirds, and so on, because they have diverse habitats in the various backyards.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Katie Fairhead. I have a question directed for you, Mr. O'Toole. I, too, have also called Portland home at one time, and you've obviously said quite a few things about Portland, that some of which I disagree with, but there's one in particular I'd like to respond to and ask you about. You put up 2 pictures of traffic calming devices, and you basically accused the government of slowing cars down for no reason. But in my experience, and in a couple of places in Portland that I know of, those traffic calming devices are meant to protect pedestrians. So specifically, you had a picture of the street narrowing, which I also did find to be a hassle as a cyclist in Portland. But I know of a case in Northeast Portland where that street narrowing occurred because the lanes were so wide that there were situations where people were speeding down the street, and where a pedestrian wasn't visible in front of another car, a little boy was killed crossing the street to a park. So one of my concerns about completely removing government from planning, especially when it comes to transportation and getting around, is that we lose a place to talk about and a place to plan to build in protections for the vulnerable, which in our transportation system, I would say are pedestrians and cyclists. So I'd like to hear, my real concern is that without any government intervention, and maybe we do have too much, but without any government intervention, the priority becomes moving cars to and from as fast as possible, and we no longer have protections for other people that may be wanting to use those roads. And so I'd like to hear what you think about how a market-based solution could take that into account.
One of the problems with government land use planning is that the planners claim they're going to do comprehensive planning, taking into account, say, pedestrian safety and cycling and watershed and air pollution and all the other things, but it's just too complicated to deal with all those things. So they always end up just focusing on one thing, and usually it's the wrong thing. And in Portland, they're focused on getting people out of their cars. And so what they're doing is they're making the streets harder to drive on. And they're doing it in the name of making the streets safer for pedestrians and bicycles, but they aren't necessarily doing that. For example, they're taking one-way streets and turning them into two-way streets. Now, we have excellent data showing that when you turn two-way streets into one-way streets, you make them safer. You have fewer vehicle-to-vehicle collisions, you have fewer vehicle-to-pedestrian collisions. When you turn them back into two-way streets, you end up having more vehicle-to-pedestrian collisions. But they say they're doing it for the pedestrians. And after the more pedestrians get hit, they say, well, we expected that. The reality is that in ordinary city streets, the incidence of pedestrians getting killed is very low. But when you slow down the traffic, you reduce emergency response times. And it's very critical, if somebody has a heart attack, for example, that emergency services get to them within so many minutes or they're dead. And studies have shown, and they've been verified in Boulder, Colorado, Austin, Texas, and other places, that when you use traffic calming to supposedly make streets safer for pedestrians, you're going to kill 30 people due to delays in emergency response vehicles for every pedestrian whose life you saved. So real comprehensive planning wouldn't do those things, but the problem is that Portland isn't doing comprehensive planning. They're focused on this one insane idea, which is we have to get people out of their cars, no matter what the cost, to safety or anything else.
What should Portland's priority be then? If getting people out of their cars is not the right priority, what do you see as the right priority?
I think the one right priority is enabling people to move around better. One way to do that would be to build some more roads or smooth out the traffic flows on existing roads using things like congestion pricing and better traffic signal coordination. Portland has a goal of making all highways in the area to have congestion to what's called level of service F, which is stop and go traffic during rush hour to get people out of their cars. That's a dumb goal. Building a new highway, a new freeway for cars is actually a pedestrian-friendly device because it gets the cars off the streets and onto the grade-separated freeway, leaving the streets for more bicycles and pedestrians. Instead, we're seeing more conflicts between vehicles and pedestrians in Portland than ever before.
Thank
Then-
you. We're going to move on to
Okay.
the next question. Thank you, though. Last question. Oh, is there one over there, too?
Yeah.
Okay, then one on each side, and, yeah, go ahead.
You can go first.
Hi, my question is for Mr. O'Toole. I noticed throughout your presentation that most of the public opinion surveys and data that you cited were from between 13 and 15 years ago. And I was curious how you felt that public opinion or the situation in general may have changed since the time that data was collected, whether your views reflected that, and how you think your vision for America really is an adequate solution moving in terms of the longer future rather than, say, the next decade.
My vision for America is that people should be free to choose where they want to live and how they want to get around, and that they should pay the full cost of their choices. Whether we end up with a society that is suburban, ex-urban, urban, or some mixture, I don't really care. I just want people to be free to choose to do it. And instead what I see are people saying, oh, we're going to run out of oil, so therefore we have to spend $1 trillion on high-speed rail, and it's going to get 1% of people out of their cars. It's not going to do anything about oil, but it's going to waste a lot of money. I don't see the point in that. I want to have user-funded transportation. I want to have housing that the users pay for it, and so on and so forth. What we end up with is not up to me, it's up to the users.
Thank you. And our final question?
Hi, my name is Julian, and I'd just like to thank both of you all for coming here and speaking to us. And my question, like Dan's, has a lot to do with the interactions and the intersections between both of your arguments. I guess it's primarily directed at you, Mr. O'Toole. And so my question has to deal with design. And in thinking about your example of this community in Houston, I'm curious about where the developers originated their ideas for the type of housing planning when they went about creating this community, and what theories, if you know, or if you could postulate, about space usage they subscribe to. And if, as you seem to mention in your presentation, it has anything at all to do with creating multiple services like recreational parks, well, you mentioned a water park, service-oriented businesses such as supermarkets or community banks, then don't you think that has a lot to do with the other gentleman's presentation about how there seems to be a natural evolution or a tendency for cities now, what he is predicting, a regression towards the smaller city paradigm. There's actually what I would think is kind of a Jacobian, Jane Jacobs' perspective on city life and city usage, which really has a lot to do with urban density and where you think those intersections might lie. If you need me to clarify, I'm sorry that's a little convoluted. I'd be more than welcome to.
Well, it's interesting. I interviewed the developer of that particular development. It's called Sienna Plantation. If you ever want to look it up, it's on the web. You could go to Flickr. There's a lot of good pictures by some of the residents. And the developer said, we have single-family homes. That's our main profit. We have a commercial area with grocery stores and things like that. That helps bring the single-family homeowners in because then they know they don't have to drive a long way to get a gallon of milk. But the commercial area only works if we have a lot of people. So then we have a multifamily home place. We don't make any profit on the multifamily homes, but we put it in there to attract the commercial, and we put the commercial in to attract the single-family homeowners. So their calculus is very thoughtful. They've gone through and figured out, what do people want? Most people want a single-family home. Some people will live in a multifamily home, so we'll provide that too. And everybody wants to be close to a grocery store, so we'll provide enough density to get people to get the grocer to build a store there. And of course, their calculus goes into a lot more detail, but it's interesting when you talk to an urban planner, their calculus has nothing to do with what people want or what finances are or anything like that. For example, you find if you go to a city that doesn't have planning or zoning, you find very few 4- and 5-story buildings. The reason for that is Americans will only walk up 1 or 2 stories. So if you put in more than 3 stories, you have to have an elevator. But if you put in an elevator, it doesn't pay for itself unless you get 6 stories or more. So you see 2-story buildings, 3-story buildings, and 6 stories on up. You don't see 4- and 5-story buildings. Well, guess what the urban planners want to do? They want to build 4- and 5-story buildings everywhere. It makes no financial sense, but they're building them all over Portland with huge subsidies. So I would prefer to go with the private planners rather than the government planners, because I think they try to figure out what people want and not what people ought to have.
But don't
You may have an alternative view.
I do.
Okay. I was just going to give you the last word, unless you had another question.
Well, I mean, I was going to say that the distinction in that might lie between the differences between residential development and business commercial development, which I think you might have hinted at, but by all means.
Final word?
I really didn't even understand your question. You said it was convoluted, and you were correct.
Okay.
If you could, get it down to something
Feel
more.
free to come up here after and ask them individually. I just got word that there won't be the small catered reception, but our speakers will be hanging around for a while. So please come down and.
Wait a minute.
Yeah, that's what I said. There's no reception. Yeah. Just feel free to come down and talk with them.
Were we disqualified from being received?
And with that, let's end this event and have one more hand for our great speakers. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, you're a good sport, Randal. The culture of the automobile and its effects on our lives.